This is probably going to be one of the most off the cuff videos that I am going to do, so just to warn you ahead of time. I haven't done a lot of like bookish discussion videos on my channel quite yet, even though it's coming down the pipeline, but I figured for this particular subject matter, it was kind of warranted considering how it kind of showed up. It's interesting that this popped up, and I'm recording this after the 10 worst books that I've ever read video, but this was not intentional. It was not intentional, but I figure, you know, if I'm going to discuss this, then I'm going to have a productive discussion for it. Hi everyone, my name is Rose, also known as TA Summers. Welcome back to my channel, and it's good to see everyone after the holiday. I had a really good start to my vacation in terms of the December holiday and marching up to the new year. So I took a little bit of a break, but I'm back at it, trying to see like if I can take some time, like while I'm having an extended break from my day job, to record videos, to be able to read, to be able to devote more time to my channel. So you'll see more videos coming like in progressively. But what I wanted to do today was do a discussion topic on something that popped up. As usual, in social media, you have a lot of things that happen in terms of discourse that is considered controversial or hot takes or anything like that. But this particular one is one that's kind of near and dear to my heart because I have a number of reasons of why I love reading YA, but specifically, I love reading it for the quality of the stories, the different groups that are highlighted across different within the age group, and also because I write it myself. As I'm not published as of yet, but still working on it. But other than that, I figure it would be interesting to do a little bit of a deep dive of a discussion for this particular controversial take. We'll say it like that. So the subject of this particular video is going to be what books are essentially geared toward and targeted for and meant for young adults. So that's kind of the umbrella of what we're going to be discussing today. But without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get started in terms of what led to this particular discussion that I'm about to do today. So essentially, I was going through my social media on Twitter, and usually like I try to check in with Twitter like a few times a day, like in terms of stuff, because I try to keep up with people who I follow on social media, whether it's other booktubers or people in the bookish community that I try to keep up with. And I noticed that there were a lot of people talking about the particular tweet that I'm going to put up on the screen for your reference here. So the discussion started out for this particular person, and I'm intentionally not putting the name of or the profile picture of the person who made these tweets because I don't want to start a pile on. I just want to have a discussion. So just if you know this particular person, please don't pile on. Please, for the sake of everyone involved, just don't do it. It's not worth it. It's not worth it at all. But essentially, this particular tweet came across my timeline in terms of prompting a discussion about basically being exposed to different levels of literature at like when you're a teenager. So this particular person had said, seeing some hand wringing about popular book talk sexy books being shelved as YA at Target. Just a reminder that many of us read these as teens. Of course, we're all a bunch of sickos now. So, and the tweet has covers of 4 different books that are featured. One is V.C. Andrews' Flowers in the Attic. Another one is Stephen King's Pet Sematary. Another one is The Clan of the Cave Bear by Jean M. Auel, which is part of the Earth's Children series, and Anne Rules the Stranger Beside Me. So of these particular books, I want to say that the only one that I actually read as a teenager was Flowers in the Attic by V.C. Andrews. That's just an aside note. But the tweet thread continues and essentially says, this is the photo in question. Don't want to tag anyone because I see where they're coming from, but my hot take is that almost every book here is or should be considered YA. I'm sorry, but this is what teens read. They have shit to figure out, and books are a safe place to do that. And then it shows a picture of a display at Target with the label young adult, and essentially has a whole list of actual adult titles listed on the shelves of this particular Target display. But essentially none of the books that are featured in this particular photo are considered or marketed to or for young adult, with the exception of Demon Slayer, which, if you know of the manga series Demon Slayer, that is a book with a teen protagonist, and it is aimed for teens. And it is actually a pretty interesting series. I would love to actually review that on my channel at a later date, but we'll get to that. But I took a look at this particular tweet, and oh my word, it was quote tweeted into existence, ratioed into existence for the number of people who were upset. Upset is the word. But among the books that were listed in this particular display were a number of Colleen Hoover books. I don't want to talk about Coho, but in this video we're going to do that. But Colleen Hoover is one. The Love Hypothesis by Ali Hazelwood is another that's seen here. The Spanish Love Deception. The Atlas Six by Olivia Blake. Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. Daisy and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. Young Gods by Katie Robert. The Sarah J. Maas series, which starts with A Court of Thorns and Roses. That is definitely not YA literature. It was classified as YA literature a while back, and I have the original covers for the series for when it was marketed by YA, but as the series continued, it was very, very clear that this particular series is an adult series, but it has had some crossover appeal to young adults and within a certain range, usually older young adults, usually older teens. So I've been aware of the discussion and the dialogue and the controversy regarding A Court of Thorns and Roses. So, you know, like, and I do plan on actually reviewing that series on this channel at some point, but it is just coming down the pipeline. But I'm basically saying that A Court of Thorns and Roses was at one point considered YA, but it is no longer considered YA, and the marketing for that has shifted with further installations in the series and dialogues about it. So I'll just leave that where it is. Looks like Elle Kennedy, who is a new adult author. Good Girl Complex and The Deal are featured on here. Tessa Bailey, who is definitely not a YA author, has never written for young adults. I'm not even sure why she was listed on here, but Hook, Line, and Sinker is featured on here. The Honeymooners by Christina Lauren, that's a new adult book. That's not necessarily intended for teenagers. Red, White, Royal Blue by Casey McQuiston. That is definitely not a YA book, even though Casey McQuiston has written for young adults. I'm actually reading right now Kissing Sarah Wheeler, which I checked out of my library, and that is definitely a YA book, but Red, White, and Royal Blue, not intended for young adults. And then the kicker in all of this, in terms of this display, A Little Lie by Hanya Yanagihara. That is not a YA book. That has so many difficult subjects that I would not put that in the hands of a teenager. I'm like, what are you thinking? No, just no. Not even remotely intended for teenagers at all. Even I, as an adult,
know that I can't pick up a Little Lie, because I know what it's about and I know how difficult so many of the things that are in that book. One of these days, I will probably pick up A Little Lie and try it for myself in terms of stuff, and then I may even review it on the channel. But I have to be emotionally ready to pick up that book, because it is not an easy read, and it's not something that I would put in the hands of a teenager, because it is traumatizing. So, just essentially all of these books, and with the exception of Demon Slayer, are all marketed adult books. So my thought was at first, in terms of seeing the target display, I did not think of it as anything ill-informed or ill-intentioned. I thought it was just one of those things where, you know how target displays end up getting changed all the time, and sometimes people move stock around in Target, like based on like where they want to put displays, certain book displays or certain shelf displays of things, and it may have just been that they were in the process of moving stuff, and that used to be the young adult section, but they want to focus it on either bestsellers or book top suggestions or things like that, and it's probably just like the targeted employee who was a part of that probably didn't even think twice about it. But this particular person who featured this particular take, I think did not do this with good intentions in mind. I just like it's hard for me to think that this person who is talking about all of these particular books who that are featured in YA like would be taking a picture of books that were notably popular among adults and adult readers on TikTok and social media and things like that. Like it doesn't seem to me that this person really grasped that these books aren't actually intended for teens, but we'll talk about that in the given discussion coming up. To highlight a few responses, ones that I thought were really invested in terms of reacting to this particular thought, Kelly Jensen, who has been a part of a lot of book initiatives recognizing teens and working for teens and librarians, and writing YA compilations like Body Talk, tweeted this person and says, "Tell me you don't work with or know actual teenagers without telling me you don't work with or know actual teenagers. Sure, some read this, but these books are primarily read by adults and adult book talkers," and that's essentially what I said as well. The other, some of the other tweets that I thought were interesting responses to this particular tweet. Kat Sebastian, who writes romance books, who said, did not directly quote this tweet, but was writing about this particular tweet, said, seriously cannot be the only person on this website to grasp the difference between teenagers reading a thing and knowing they are not the intended audience, and teens reading a thing and knowing it's specifically for them. Both of these things happen and they are not the same. Yes, obviously teenagers will always consume media that is beyond their maturity. Sometimes this is fine, sometimes it's not. But having access to things that are actually made for them in the place they are in life is important, and I fully agree with that as well. Katie Robert, who was one of the adult romance authors who was had a book that was featured in the particular tweet, actually tweeted this in response to that, saying, "Look, I read adult books as a kid, but saying those my books are inherently YA because teens can and do read them? No. I write for adults. My books are intentionally adult. I know teens read them, but calling them YA is disingenuous at best." And I don't blame Katie at all for reacting that way, because yeah, that was a hot take. I should also mention, as an important note to this particular tweet, the person who tweeted this is allegedly a librarian, so I think that kind of played into a lot of the discourse being so heated
for this particular tweet in terms of what books are meant for young adults and which ones are not, because of a lot of the controversy that is happening right now in the discourse of what literature is considered to be for meant for young adults versus those that young adults do pick up. And there is a distinct difference between books that a lot of teens and young adults pick up versus books that are intentionally targeted towards teens and young adults, and they're not the same thing. And I'll kind of get into that a little bit more as the video continues. Considering I'm someone who has a vested interest in YA literature, given that I read it and I write it, I figured, yes, I am definitely going to respond to this because I have very strong feelings about it. But the first part of my response was, this is getting heavily ratioed, as it should, but adding in, no, these books are not YA. Almost all of them are adult fiction. Demon Slayer is an exception. Teens can read a range of books, but these books are not marketed to them, and saying so is a lie. Don't freaking do this. And yeah, like that was my thought when I first saw this tweet. I'm like, oh no, please, like, don't think that all of these books that are considered to be adult fiction, adult romance, these are not intended to be specifically for teenagers. Granted, considering how popular so many of these titles are, it's not uncommon to hear that some teens may, especially older teenagers, may pick up these books, but not necessarily the fact that these are oriented to teenagers. But let me continue. I followed up that initial tweet with, we have to have the conversation about teen books having a space and not getting lost and muddled with adult books. And I definitely want to emphasize that. I say this as someone who passionately writes for teens. It's not the same. The same old song and dance for argument is not helpful to teens who want to read. Yes, absolutely encourage teens to read widely and fully for what they want. I've done the same myself, but don't lie to them. And don't misclassify the works the authors designate specifically, which in terms of that, like if an author says that they write for adults, then they write for adults. You can't discount the intended audience of an author for what they write their literature for. And I want to specifically highlight that, because that is important, because a lot of times I think in the discourse of things for what literature is intended for young adults, we talk about potential for crossover, where a book may be intended for adults, but it has a lot of young adult appeals based on the particular themes and based on particular ideas that may be within a work. And we see that a lot in the sci-fi and fantasy community as well, if you are familiar with a lot of books that are in that particular genre. I read Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time as a young adult. I read The Lord of the Rings as a young adult. I read The Hobbit as a young adult. So and The Hobbit is a children's book, so it makes sense that a lot of children would be able to pick that up. Lord of the Rings is considered to be adult fantasy, but it has crossover appeal, and a lot of young adults have read that. And you can say that so many other series that may be considered adult sci-fi or adult fantasy may be picked up by teens as a way of like kind of coming into the genre itself. But let me continue. There is a nuanced conversation to be had about the differences between books a teen can read, which is quite an individual experience, and books for teens, which focus specifically on experiences teens can directly see themselves in, be heard in, and relate to. And I want to focus a bit on that particular distinction, because I think people conflate the two and they think it's the same thing, but it's not. Because when you have a book that's specifically oriented towards teens,
it deals with specific. There's a number of different things that go into the writing for young adults specifically, whether it's the tone, whether it's the language and the dialogue that's used, whether it's certain pieces of jargon, whether it's linguistic things, whether it's themes that are specifically oriented to teens that aren't considered in the same vernacular as adult literature and adult themes, in terms of you can have um, conversations about literature where there's crossover appeal, but when you say that a book is oriented towards teens specifically, there are elements that make it distinctly for young adults. So, regarding this particular tweet, in terms of reacting, in terms of taking books that were written and intended for an adult audience being picked up by teens just because there may be elements of it that may appeal to teens um, within a piece of adult literature does not necessarily mean it is intended or written for YA. And I think it's important to distinguish that difference. Continuing on, last thing, I read V.C. Andrews as a teen myself, and I knew her books were not meant for me as a teen. Andrews had some protagonists that were teenagers, which had situations I could relate to, but I never thought Andrews' books were YA. They were always classified as adult. I acknowledged Andrews as an adult author, whereas, say, Lois Duncan, Sharon M. Draper, Virginia Hamilton, and Anne M. Martin, those are authors that I read a lot in my as a child and as a teenager, just to cite, wrote books that were intended to speak to me and about teens like me, with a voice that was like mine, and I readily sought their work out. There's a conversation to be had also that just because a book has crossover appeal between groups doesn't necessarily make it for that group. There are books that definitely cross well with teens, but crossover shouldn't be default. Let kids, teens have their unique spaces. And I want to emphasize that last tweet very, very heavily, because the controversy that I think is happening right now in terms of young adult literature is that there is a large market of adults that are picking up YA, and that's not a bad thing. I think young adult can be consumed by a wide range of audiences for different reasons, and there's nothing wrong with that. Absolutely, there's nothing wrong with that. But I think if we're talking about the young adult age group specifically, like in terms of books that are targeted for teens specifically, then we have to remember that these books are intended for teens primarily. So, and I think this conversation, like is important to distinguish, because I think even with the rise of a lot of young adult books and series like Twilight, which it can be very easy to dunk on Twilight, like in terms of the current vernacular, but I'm gonna say that when Twilight was published, the cultural shift of what how people received young adult books really changed the game and a lot of things, for some of it for good and some for a lot of bad. And I think people don't understand the fact that um, when we're talking about young adult literature is intended primarily for teen consumption, and we can't forget that this is for these kids and teens, which is usually between the ages of 12 and 18, specifically for YA. So, that should be the standard, and that should be the way that we approach it in terms of stuff, even though other audiences consume and talk about YA and even write YA, but it's important to remember the primary audience, and it's important to remember to have them at the forefront of mind, because if we get to the point where we don't remember that young adult is for that specific age range, it's going to get to the point where that audience feels like that they're left out of the discussions and also not be represented properly in this age group of books that are intended for them. So I just want to clarify that with respect to my final tweet in this thread. I think when we're talking about um, kids and teens in terms of literature that they are not ready for, we undervalue their ability to say, I am not ready for this, let me put it aside or put it away for right now and I will get to it later. And I think there are so many people who are trying to overtake the voices of teenagers who can make those decisions for themselves in terms of what they are ready for and what they are not ready for. And I think it needs to be an open discussion in terms of, because it's such an individual experience for young adults in terms of what literature appeals to them. I think there should be more open dialogue in terms of talking about what teenagers want in terms of the literature that they're consuming. And if we listen to those particular dialogues, then we'll have a better idea of um, what needs to be in the literature that is crafted for young adults. Because if it's for young adults, then if it's YA, it is intended for teenagers. It is intended for the young adult audience. It is not intended for an adult audience. It is not intended for middle grade. It is not intended for children's. It is intended for young adult if it is considered designated young adult. So I think that should be at the forefront of a lot of people's minds, regardless of the dialogue that we have. Young adult literature needs to be oriented specifically to young adults. And then when we classify young adult literature, we have to keep that in the forefront of the mind in terms of the marketing, in terms of the presentation, in terms of all of that. It can't be this situation where we blur the lines of it to the point where we're forgetting the audience who these books are aimed for. And I think that's really important to remember and to consider. And I would also say that in terms of my reading habits, like I've talked about this on my Goodreads several times, and I may have talked about it specifically just in other venues, but I can specifically remember a time that my mom, who unfortunately is no longer living, um, took a book out of my hands when I was a teenager, and that had a significant impact on me. It was Daughters of Eve by Lois Duncan. And Lois Duncan was one of my go-to authors when I was a teenager. I read Down a Dark Hall, I read Killing Mr. Griffin, I read I Know What You Did Last Summer. I saw the movie later on, in which it had nothing to do with the book, but it is what it is. I still like the movie for what it was, though. But anyway, it was the fact that Lois Duncan was one of my favorite authors, my favorite go-to authors, and she always, even though Lois Duncan is also no longer with us, she had such a profound impact on young adult literature when it came to mystery, suspense, thriller for like in terms of teens and being able to pick up her works, and it spanned several decades. But essentially, the reason why my mom took that book out of my hand is the fact that Daughters of Eve dealt with a particularly difficult subject with respect to teenagers being a part of a cult, and that cult being heralded by a trusted figure who was a teacher in that particular book. And there were other things about it that she did not agree with, and she did not realize. Like, I guess she just picked up the book and said, "No, you can't read it," and just took it back to the library. And I remember that having a profound impact on me, and be like, why can't I read this book? Why do you think that I can't handle the themes and the discussions regarding this book? It took me a total of about 15 years to get back to that book, to pick it up again, and to be able to read it finally in full. And even then, like, I had mixed feelings about it, but even then, I'm like, even back then as a teenager, I could handle that. It's like, what was the point of taking it out of my hands and preventing me from reading it? Like, because in terms of stuff, we can have opinions about the books that we pick up, in terms of stuff, and the point of being able to pick up literature is to be able to not only take in the stories that are being told, but also to be able to discuss them and discuss the thoughts about them, and being able to have a discourse. When you start taking books out of the hands of kids and teenagers who are consuming different books that are intended for them, that tackle a range of different subjects, you stop the dialogue. And the point of having literature is to be able to see people's different experiences and being able to have a dialogue about them. When you stop that, you stop all dialogue, you stop all discourse, you stop all of the constructed things that you can learn and dissect and deal with. And that is one of the things that I don't like in this current culture of book banning. And you can say that I have a lot of strong feelings about this. I have a lot of strong feelings about this, but that formative experience, even with the fact of what I dealt with, Lois Duncan's Daughters of Eve being taken out of my hands as a 15-year-old, and then not being able to read it for years after the fact, it affected me because of the fact that I could not have the dialogues and discussion that came from that book with the people who were around me, because apparently, because of the fact that it was deemed against my will, mind you, that I could not handle that material for myself. I would like, and I feel like there are a lot of teens who probably can relate to that experience, in terms of stuff like, I can handle more things than you think that I can handle, in terms of what I pick up. If it's something that I can't handle, move it to the side. If it's something that I can, then let me make the decision for myself instead of speaking for me. So, and that's it's interesting, because that's a quintessential thing for about like the things that we talk about in young adult fiction, in terms of teens being able to know that they have a voice to be heard from, and also to be able to be trusted to know um, how to approach different topics and issues and things like that, and being able to synthesize what they learn and what they pick up from what they read and consume and things like that. So I think there is a discussion to be had in terms of not just considering the literature that appeal to teens, and what teens pick up, but also being able to listen to them and see, this is what I am able to handle, which this is what I'm not able to handle, and being able to hear from the age group themselves, instead of being transposing what one thinks a teenager can't handle in terms of things. But if we're talking about this particular tweet specifically, this particular tweet is transposing their particular experiences as a teenager on the current teenager's experience, which is absolutely not something that you want to do. Just because you were a teenager in the 80s, picking up certain pieces of literature and stuff like that, does not mean that you can speak for teenagers who are in time and transpose your thoughts upon them, especially if you are a part of the same group of people who they have different things that they want to discuss or read about, or even not read about. But the important thing is to be able to have the discussion of saying, hey, what's something that you want to read about, what's something you want to hear about, and what do you not want to read about, and then being able to tailor to that particular audience instead of listening to people who aren't informed about that audience and who aren't informed about what issues young adults care about. So that's where I am on that. I know I'm heated, but I want to make that clear.
I think one thing that I want to point out in this particular video is when we're talking about kids and teens determining what they read about and what books they pick up and what they don't pick up, kids and teenagers have as much right to agency as any other age group. So it's important to be able to find the balance of being able to see um, what kids and teens can learn from and experience in literature while also respecting the fact that they have a say in terms of what um, literature they want to pick up when they're ready for it and when they're not ready for it. So um, and I know this gets lost in this particular conversations because of a lot of things of what discussions that we have with respect to what's considered harmful, what's considered controversial, what's considered to be things that are uh, available conversations about a number of different things and what kids and teens are ready for with respect to where they are in life. But I think it is important also not just to take into consideration of what a kid and teen may be ready for individually or even developmentally, but also being able to respect the agency of that kid or teen. So when we talk about young adult literature in terms of things, and especially in the current climate now, with respect to that agency being questioned or that agency being seen as not taken as seriously and taken with the respect that it deserves, that's a problem. That is a total problem that we're seeing in terms of, because the agency of kids and teens are not being only considered but also respected and heard. So I think it's essential that we continue to center the focus if we're talking about literature that is meant to orient towards teens and young adult. We have to respect that agency. We have to respect that the ability of kids and teens who fall in the young adult range, have the ability to say, this is what I want, this is what I'm ready for, this is what I want to hear about. So I think that needs to be a part of the focus of these discussions, and being able to center that, especially when we're talking about literature intended for teens specifically. And I think it's also important to consider that if we're talking about discussions of agency, that these discussions are made in the form of open dialogue between teens and the people that are in their lives, whether it may be a parent, whether it may be a teacher, whether it may be a trusted comrade. Like the fact that there are so many different dialogues that are shutting down the agency of teens to make decisions in terms of what they want to read and they want to read about, and then what respectively they want to hear about in the spectrum of things, and having it be determined by other people and other parties who may think that they are acting in the best interests of teenagers without necessarily including them in the dialogue. I think that's important to point out in terms of how we treat this and how
how we're able to respect that, regardless of where you are in terms of being able to see individually in terms of what literature is available and what people read about. You have to respect the agency of people in terms of what they want from literature, and being able to have open conversations and open dialogue in terms of discussing a wide range of issues and things. So it's, and this can differ from different communities. This can differ from different spectrums in terms of where people are. But the thing about it is, it's like, you, if you're having these discussions, you can't shut out certain communities. You can't shut out um, like the culture that's going on right now in terms of book banning and things like that. It has one specific group that is trying to shut out the dialogue of a lot of other groups, and that is where the contentions lie, because it's one group who is trying to speak for a whole other different distinctions of groups that are intersections of race, intersections of gender, intersections of religion, intersections of things. There's one specific group who is trying to overtake the dialogue of all of these other groups, and that is where the pushback is happening. So it's a contentious environment in terms of stuff that completely takes away agency from all these other different groups for the sake of one group who is loud and just not really respectful of those particular groups. So, you know, it's a tough one. It's a tough one to be able to see right now. So yeah, I guess that's basically the sum of my thoughts in terms of this particular discussion. But I think in terms of the end thoughts that I have for this particular topic, the TL, the too long didn't read version of this is for me to say that I think teens should be able to determine what they wish to read and what they should do not wish to read. That we should have discussions with teens in terms of what appeals to them, in terms of what they want out of literature and what allows them to be more seen. And if we're going to call something, consider something to be specifically young adult literature, then it needs to be labeled as young adult literature intended for the audience that it's going towards, and not necessarily have um, people who are outside of that overtaking the voices and the appeals and the stories that teens want, that are intended for them, specifically for them, even though other audiences may peruse that particular age group for their own reference. But the end thought that I have is that I don't think adult literature should be necessarily the go-to um, factor, like in terms of, like, if you have a book that is considered adult literature but it has crossover appeal to teens, it shouldn't necessarily be said that that adult book is marketed for teens specifically. It just means that it's crossover appeal. It does not necessarily mean that it's specifically written with the intention of teens in mind. And I think that's an important distinction to make when we're talking about young adult literature and the differences between books that teens can read versus those that are intended specifically for teens, young adults. So that's my spiel. Thank you for watching this particular video. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button, and hit the notification bell to receive updates on videos like this and others that I may upload to the channel. Thank you again. I hope you are having a wonderful day, and I'll see you next video.